Hello and welcome to Kurious City. My name is Letty and I'm one of the co-founders of Kurious Arts. This is a podcast all about encouraging people to get curious about what's going on creatively across the city. I will be talking to a collection of individuals and organisations and companies that are making an impact, and it's all about trying to encourage you to get off the sofa and get out into the world. Let's have a listen to who we're talking to today. Hello everyone, with me today in the studio I've got not one but two lovely Kurious City guests. They are Sian Williams and Allie Carr, who both describe themselves as artists, socialists and performers. They both work part-time at universities. They both spend time in studios alone and also collaborating with others. Hello.
Hiya.
Hi. Thank you so much for joining me today. So first of all, could you tell me a little bit, I'll ask you first, Sian.
Okay.
And same question coming to you, Ali. Can you tell us a little bit more about your work?
So I'm going to context this a little bit about myself. So I moved to Sheffield in 2013 to do a master in fine art at Sheffield Hallam. I lived in London before that. I did my undergraduate in Falmouth College of Arts in Cornwall.
Gosh, I've really gone the length and breadth of the country.
I've gone the length and breadth, yeah. Originally from Surrey, so sort of somewhere like south in the middle. I started off as a painter, and then after my undergraduate, which I finished in 2002, I had almost a decade of rejecting art quite significantly.
Gosh. What do you mean by that, rejecting art?
I think I had quite a romantic idea of what being an artist was when I finished my BA, which was this kind of like, I'm just going to get a studio and a job and everything will be fine. And then it wasn't fine, because actually it's a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And I moved to London in 2004 and kind of just got distracted, really. But art was kind of always there in the background, but I didn't really call myself an artist until I moved to Sheffield.
Okay.
And I started on the MA 2013, and I think what I thought I was going to do was probably some prints, some drawings, but all quite kind of small, probably quite conservative stuff, although I wouldn't have called it conservative at the time.
Sensing a... And then what I ended up doing was making a sculpture that was also a performance. I mean... That's blown my mind. How does that work?
So basically, I made a big balloon out of tissue paper that I inflated with hot air, and that was my MA piece.
How big are we talking?
We're talking like it would fill this room.
This is quite a big room for those of you listening at home.
I'm 5'5", and it would come fully inflated. It would come to sort of just below my head,
right?
And then it would be the same across.
Gosh.
So yeah, it's quite big. And that was quite a surprise to me. And I think what I've done since is basically make sculptures that are in some way performative or reference performances. But every time I do it, I'm always a bit like, oh, that's not what I intended to do.
That's interesting. So it kind of has a life of its own, really.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm kind of interested in that, like, I guess, I think my practice is rooted in sculpture, really. But I'm interested in how you kind of suggest that something theatrical or the sort of intimacy of a performance happening as well.
Wow.
That's quite a long answer.
No, it's very, very nice answer.
Thanks.
Ali?
Yeah, so I'll have to back up as well. I did an MFA when I was 28, I think. So when I started, it was 2 years, and I went to California to do it.
Wow.
I went to Cal Arts. Yeah, which is a kind of a nuts thing to do, but I'm the kind of person. It did take a lot of work.
Is that quite a prestigious? Is that the place to go, Cal Arts? Apart from obviously Falmouth.
Yeah,
obviously.
No, it's not. It's not like it's very particular. Method acting is where you put one element of Stanislavski's plan. I can't remember what you call it. Thing on steroids. And that's method acting. You put one element,
right,
which is is it the what if? It's like the part.
I should actually know that.
I've got a really good analogy, but I'm really mangling it. But it's like basically you've got a holistic system on acting, and then the method is where you just put one element of it and really focus on that.
Okay. And so it's like a microcosm, like an intense microcosm.
Yeah, it's
one aspect.
Exactly. So kind of. So Cal Arts is where discussion, critical discussion, is put on steroids. So that's the thing,
Right.
and that's what I wanted to go for. So
Wow.
it's kind of, so what happens is it's not a holistic, what happens is it doesn't feel holistic or well-rounded. It feels like you put this one, you develop this one aspect. So that's why I went, because I did a BA, and when I was on my BA, I did an exchange to Finland, or I set it up, and then I met an artist from New York, and it was too much of a stretch for him to understand Scandinavian socialism, and then it was too much of a stretch for the Finnish students to understand what this like crazy New Yorker was talking about. So I became this intermediary, like I was kind of
like a sort of translator.
Yeah, exactly, a cultural translator. And then Daniel, the American, said, "You're Cal Arts. You are Cal Arts. You are Cal Arts style." So I pocketed that, and it took me a long time for that. So I finished my BA in 2001. So I went to my MFA in 2007.
Right. Okay.
So it took me a long time to like put everything in place. Went for 2 years, and then kind of fell into a PhD when I got back. Hadn't really planned that. And an element of kind of what happened when I was on my MFA was that I was making work that was recreations of cigarette cards that I'd found at a car boot sale. And so they were basically mini pin-ups, and I recreated them using myself. And when I took that to Cal Arts...
when you say that, do you mean physically? So you kind of, do you dress up as these pictures? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was very labour intensive, and I shot it on film and I printed it myself. So yeah, it involved all the styling, costume, procuring or making.
Okay, I can see how you're both
years.
sort of with the visual and the performance elements coming through.
Yeah. So I took this, and I can't tell you how many times in discussion or in tutorials with a wide variety of people, the essay Laura Mulvey's Visual Pleasure in Narrative Cinema, written in the 1970s, came up. So I realised it was some kind of a corrective, right? And I knew that that I didn't think it hit the nail on the head. And then I left my MFA, and I thought, oh no, I'm not ready for the world. I didn't hit the nail on the head. Like I didn't win that argument. You know what I mean? I was part of the argument, but I didn't walk away thinking I know what I'm on about. I won it. But I didn't think about a PhD. It wasn't like when I left in June, I knew I was going to go and do a PhD. I couldn't get a job, and and I'd applied for photo technician at Hallam, and I couldn't get an interview. So out of desperation, I had a look at all the jobs at Hallam, and this PhD was advertised like a job, and it was a teaching researcher post, they called it, but it was a PhD, a funded PhD. So I got that, and really what I was interested in was kind of speaking back to this essay and kind of correcting an aspect of it. And how I did that was in Laura Mulvey's essay. She talks about the woman in classic Hollywood film is like a cipher for the male gaze. So the showgirl in the films she's talking about, she has no subjectivity of her own. She's just a holding point for different kinds of look. The director, the male protagonist, the man in the audience. She isn't herself in her own right. And I thought, I'm going to find out who she is. So I did a PhD on showgirls, which involved going to 20 different showgirl shows from large-scale spectacles in Paris, Vegas, Los Angeles, cabarets, alt cabaret, burlesques, gentlemen's clubs, and I wrote about that. And then I also kind of looked at other ways of understanding how we look. So I'm interested in the idea of the grab now rather than the gaze. So that's what I did. And then after that, now I've kind of carried on those themes. My PhD has come out as a book, and now I kind of photograph theatre interiors, and I'm interviewing Tiller girls. So I've made a video already of a old lady dancer. And I also do like little collages and paintings. So it's like I found a conversation that is really generative to me. And so I've now got this post-PhD, I have this sense of real freedom in terms of how I work. So sometimes I perform or sing in front of works, and I have a kind of a broad way of working. But I have fun.
Well, that's the key, isn't it? So it kind of brings me nicely onto my next question. So you both define yourself as socialists. And how does that manifest itself in your work? I mean,
That's the big
That's
question.
the really big question that I think me and Ali have been thinking about an awful lot recently.
Yes.
Particularly since obviously the election last year. I kind of had a moment in 2018. So I work at the University of Sheffield in professional services. And in 2018, we went on strike over changes to the USS pension. And I've been a member of a trade union since I was 27, maybe 26, 27. And I've been on strike before in other jobs, but never for such an extended amount of time. And
how long was it?
It was 14 days spread over 4 weeks. Okay. So it was essentially a month, really, with little days here and there where you went back to work. And it was also in the middle of the Beast from the East. So it was like a really, really kind of intense physical experience. Like I can't really, it felt really profound in terms of what we were doing, but also in terms of those of us who joined the picket, what we were experiencing. I mean, there was a whole smorgasbord. There was one day when it was snowing so much I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And I went a little bit crazy that day and started going, down with the government! At which point, one of the people on my picket said, maybe you should just go home, Sian. Because you picket for a certain amount of hours, and we were towards the end, and he was like, you've done enough.
Lost it. You've actually lost it.
Yeah, just get warm, have a cup of tea, come back tomorrow. But after that, kind of going through this really profound, what felt like quite a transformative experience, I was involved with something called Festival of the Mind, or was invited to be part of the Festival of the Mind. And what you have to do with Festival of the Mind is respond to certain themes that the university puts out, and you work with an academic, so it's related to their research. And the guy I was working with, his research was in utopias and utopian pedagogies, and the theme we responded to was dystopia and resistance. Actually it was dystopia / sanctuary, and we changed it to resistance a bit later.
Good shout.
Yeah, that's what we thought. And we found out we had funding for that just before the strike. And then obviously we kind of had these ideas that we might meet up after the picket and talk about it. And then I was like, whoa, we can't do that because this is your research for the university. So really this is you'd be working, and that's not allowed. So it kind of interrupted our thinking about it. And one of the other people who was working on this with us made this quip about how isn't it ironic that this kind of resistance in the middle of all this, what felt quite dystopian in higher education, is what's getting in the way of us talking about dystopia and resistance.
Gosh.
Yeah.
Mind-bending stuff.
And I was like, but we need to use that then.
Yeah.
We need to use what's going on here. We need to reference. So then I came up with this idea that I wanted to reference the strike in whatever I did. And I ended up, after a kind of long thought process, getting in touch with some people who I'd met on the picket line and at rallies and stuff, and just starting a conversation basically, and ended up making a quilt. And that quilt served as quite an anomaly in my practice for quite a long time, because it was very aesthetically different to anything that I'd done before. And also it was the first time I'd ever brought a group of people together and worked in that way.
So did they
before.
contribute to the quilt? Was it a kind of what describe the quilt?
So basically there was a kind of core group of us that would meet in my studio the summer following the strike, which was also kind of ironic because it was the heat wave. Gosh, so we were
extreme.
We were reflecting on an experience that had been so incredibly cold and physically demanding whilst just sweating in my really hot studio. And we just kind of had conversations really, and everybody made patches that then went on to this quilt. So it's really brightly coloured. It's quite overt in how political it is. And yeah, for a long time I was kind of like, where does this sit? I don't really understand how this sits in my work. And I still don't exactly, but I think what it did do was make me think about how my personal political ideology can't be extricated from my practice. And it's not as obvious in everything else that I make, but it does inform a way of thinking.
It's always there, sort of, whether or not you can see it all.
Yeah, but whether that quite answers your question, because I don't think I've even answered your question myself.
No, I think it does.
I don't know,
but I guess what you're saying is it manifests itself in different ways.
Yes.
But it's always present, even if you can't necessarily see it. It's
yeah,
not immediately
because
obvious.
I mean, it's inherent to who I am.
Yes, exactly.
So it's not like those things can ever be separated, I think. But I think after the election, me and Ali talked a lot about how we can be more public about that, I suppose, without suddenly moving into making political art, because that would be disingenuous.
Can I just ask, because Ali, that question's coming to you, but do you two collaborate with each other?
No.
You don't?
No.
Do you have plans to?
No. I think
You just share interests aligned.
Yeah. We are currently supported by the Freelands Foundation through the Site Gallery. So we're going through a period of professional development at the same time, which means that I think that's bringing up for us both a period of like self-reflection and investigation.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it became clear that we had some like overlaps and kinship. So I think it's more that we've started a conversation between ourselves, and we're also thinking about how that like becomes diffused and kind of goes somewhere. So that might become, so we don't know what that is yet, but that's a thing. That's a thing. So yeah, I can answer that question. In my artwork, when I was doing my PhD, I kind of had a feminist politics that I was examining, and then it took me a long while. Like it's like the last thing I did. In fact, the last thing when I edited the book together. So this is a few years after the PhD.
What's the book called? Can I just ask?
Yeah. The book is called Viewing Pleasure and Being a Showgirl, How Do I Look? And I created a conclusion, which is called the Showgirl Manifesto. And so that was a very long journey towards saying what I think. Because I think as an artist, saying what you think is very difficult. It's like, it can be opaque even to yourself, even while you're really trying to convey what you think in writing. I mean, in this instance, it was writing, and in material outcomes. It's still really different to say what you think. And I got to the point of saying what I think. And en route, I had talked about kind of being critical of the kind of context that we live in, as in neoliberalism, and what kind of cultural context that sets. And then after my PhD, now as I look at theatre, I think about things in the theatre that are that reveal something about class. Particularly, I think more about how the showgirl tends to be working class or doesn't have a lot of power. And that transformation, that ascension onto stage is about generating a form of power and visibility. And I therefore have kind of become interested in precision line chorus troupes like the Tiller Girls, because it's a depiction of women as many that we don't really have anywhere else. So again, that's more of a kind of a feminism really, or kind of just thinking about women's collective action. But also the more I dug, I realised that John Tiller, who set up the Tiller Girls at the end of
Can you just explain to people listening what the Tiller Girls are?
Yes, it's precision kickline dancing. John Tiller set up the Tiller Girls in the Victorian period, and they carried on until the 60s, and they're trained with a lot of discipline so that their kicks are very
uniform.
This level of accuracy, it's really the height of chorus lines.
Gosh, sounds incredibly stressful.
Yeah, and actually, John Tiller recruited working class girls from Manchester and the surrounds. That was part of what he did. Both kind of like a social project, but also because those parents or those kids with that background would be fine about their children going on tour and entering the theatre.
And were they treated properly? Were they happy? Was it successful?
Yeah, mixed stories as I research, but really finding out about the Tiller Girls kind of implies a question: what happens when you give working class lasses a wage and financial independence? Well, they can make decisions in their own lives without thinking about how will I survive financially because they've got money. So it meant that sometimes different time periods have different issues, but sometimes they would come back from being a Tiller Girl and go back to their communities and were kind of not really accepted, or families would say to them, don't talk to us about that life because we don't know how to handle it.
Yeah.
But then latterly, families would be proud of their Tiller girl daughters and you know, the women who I've met now who are mature ladies have a lot of independence. You know that they might own a home and have a flat by the seaside. You know, they've lived full and interesting lives as a result.
Because it must have made such a huge impact.
Yes.
Coming at the age. Well, I mean, how old would a girl be when she was selected for or invited to be a Tiller girl?
Could be between 14 and 18.
Gosh.
When she kind of joined. Yeah.
And
she might stay there up to 5 to 10 years. She might be in the Tillers, yeah. And toured internationally. I mean, from the very early on, they got contracts all around the world.
Wow.
Yeah. So the Tiller girls are my way into a kind of gentle probing of politics. But more than that, after or during the election, I think me and Sian were really interested in, as many people were really interested in what happened at the last election and the way that our country shifted overnight and the way that kind of South Yorkshire, its face changed dramatically last December. But more than that, we realised that we were there weren't loads of us, there weren't loads of our peer group who were being vocal online and vocal in public about supporting Labour. And it occurred to us that there might be reasons for that, as in that there's a temptation for artists who might be like jobbing workers, who might, you know, like kind of precarious employment means that,
which is something that you both reference.
That there's a sense of not wanting to look unattractive, maybe now or in the future, you know, nailing your political colours to the mast. Yeah. So some people silence themselves for fear of alienating potential.
Do you think that works
or
on
business
the
or
other
clients?
on the flip side? Do you think Tory voters have the same issue, or do you think you know, as a nation across the diverse range of the parties and all of, you know, people's political views, do you think we've all become nervous about stating them, or do you think it's quite a new?
I think there was particular anxiety last election because of the anti-Semitism issues. Yeah. I think that people who were Labour were nervous about coming out as Labour. And I think there was a nervousness in talking about socialism and that kind of a commitment. In terms of other political viewpoints, I think also Brexit is the issue that rules our day. Yeah. And these things are so divisive, and it means that any dialogue, political discussion is very ramped up and very divisive.
Does that reflect in your work, like the stuff that you're producing now, that kind of feeling? Do you feel that?
Well, I'm, as an academic, as somebody who's got a PhD and someone who makes work, I'm interested in nuance. And so I think art is a place that can get you to thinking. And that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, and I think that talking about people being nervous about coming out as a Labour supporter, I think it's not just that. I think that generally you go through your life and you don't have political conversations every day because you're just busy living your life. And I think that there is sometimes, and I know I certainly feel that there's a nervousness of starting that with people because you don't know what that other person is going to think. You don't know if you're going to end up in confrontation with somebody or if they're going to say that they agree with you, and then that's great. And it's also knowing from what point do you start those conversations. Like we went to, so where I work at the University of Sheffield, we have these, because UCU is a union for everyone who works in higher education, but is often represented as a lecturers' union. So the strikes are often represented as lecturers' strikes. Those of us in professional services are always like, we're in it as well.
It's not just the lecturers.
It's not just the lecturers, because it's disingenuous, and it's also, I think it lends itself to people, media and people who are against trade unions. It lends itself to slightly kind of undermining that as like, oh, it's just these well-paid, cushy lecturers complaining kind of thing. And so we have a professional services group of UCU members who meets up, and we had, because we're about to go on strike again, we had...
Does this mean more extreme weather? Mind you.
Probably,
yeah.
You may have triggered.
Don't tempt fate.
Okay.
Don't jinx it. But we were talking about how you could talk to people about being in the union, how you could talk to people about the strike, and I think what I noticed was that people seemed to have this anxiety that they had to be able to give all of the facts and figures, and they had to be able to give all of the knowledge and all of the statistics and all of the percentages about pay and pensions. And actually, I don't think that's true. I think that you can, if you know those things, then that's really brilliant, but not everyone is. I certainly could never regurgitate all those facts, but what I can do is look at the situation that's going on and apply it to my own life and talk about how it affects my own life. And I think about that sort of to go back to your question about how does kind of socialism play out in your work. Before I made the strike, a couple of years before I made the quilt, I went on something called a DIY, which is run by an organisation called the Live Art Development Agency, who run these like short residencies.
I'm guessing it's not about plumbing.
It's not about plumbing, no. And they're run by artists for artists. And the one that I went on was in Folkestone, and it was run by a performance artist called FK Alexander. And it sounds really bonkers, but there was a group of 13 of us, and none of us knew each other, and we went and spent 2 days in silence performing a series of collective acts. And then, we carried amazing. Rocks on a beach for an hour. And at the end of it, this, on a segue, this proper old Kent geezer came up and started talking to us. And all 13 of us just kind of nodded at him because we weren't allowed to speak. And it didn't bother him at all. He just carried on for 15 minutes chatting. But anyway, that's to the side. But at the end of that, we had a kind of discussion about the importance of sort of maintaining, I guess, a sense of things being unresolved or unknown, or a sense of... We talked about how it was very important to like maintain your own ridiculousness. And I'd never really thought of that in terms... Holding space for that, I'd never thought of that in terms of a political standpoint before. Mm-hmm. And I think from that point on, I started to think more about how those like less obvious political things could play into how I thought about being a Labour supporter, about being a trade unionist, and all of those kinds of things. And then in the strike in 2018, what I became interested in was the experience of being on the picket line, and how very often that's portrayed as being really fun and great, and everyone brings flapjacks and we all have music, but a lot of the time it's just quite tedious and it's quite awkward. But in that you kind of get this really, I think, much more powerful transformational space, because it happens really slowly and it happens in really small bites. And I think that when we were talking about how do we out our socialism in our work, it's not about making big grand statements. It's about always kind of holding a space for that.
Having that continuity and
having that continuity and not being shy about it, but not feeling like you have to always be kind of waving a flag all of the time, which I think is maybe what causes people anxiety, possibly.
And talking about your kind of your lives as artists, both of you reference the fact that it's this kind of living in a perpetual state of uncertainty, and that it requires an awful lot of resilience. And how do you sustain that? How do you find that in the moments? Have there ever been any moments where you think, I can't do this anymore?
Loads.
yeah,
all the time.
After my PhD, I applied for so many jobs, exhibitions, professional development, residencies, so many things, and I just got so many rejections. But I also had a sense of lostness myself. I'd finished something. It was really an end point, and I thought to myself, that's it, I'm done. right? And then I thought, right, that's it. I'm like giving up on my art career. And then I realised that I had so little traction in terms of my art career that giving up kind of meant nothing. Like nothing changed. That day that I gave up, there weren't loads of people who were like crying because I'd quit. And then I thought to myself, well, what I'll do to cope with the new void and the pain is I'll just make a little collage. I'll just make a little bit of artwork. So I just thought what I'll do is I'll just make a little bit of artwork to help recuperate from the fact that I'm no longer an artist. And then at some point...
Fill the void with art.
Yeah, and at some point I just chilled out and I got on with it and it all worked out okay.
Do you think it was kind of you sort of processing that feeling, that sort of self-imposed feeling of failure, or as if you haven't been successful, and once you process that, you were able to get on with your art?
Absolutely. And from that moment on, it was a bit like, it's a bit like I'm still in that phase now of making art to just recuperate being me, right? To I know my own, it's like I forefront my own pleasure in my artwork. You know what I mean? Like when I make art, I have a right laugh. And I honestly, you know, like when I look at my own work now, in the past I've had a more of a strained relationship to my own practice, but I look at it and go, oh, that's good, that. And that is the bottom line. You know, like I realise that if I don't enjoy the making, that's the point when I really do give up. But while I enjoy the part where I make art, then I'm in the game, right? I'm doing it. And the rest is all the cherry on the cake. But making art and enjoying making art makes the rest of what you kind of have to do to sustain a career, to leverage a career, more palatable. Yeah. Because I enjoy the making.
So if someone accused that of being a self-indulgent act, say, you know, because obviously creatives and artists, we're constantly met with, oh, it's just self-indulgent and it's not really important who's it for, why is it important, why do we need it, which obviously is obvious. But how do you counterbalance that argument with the fact that the other half of the life, the stuff that you have to do in order to sustain that, the pleasure that making art gives you?
Well, I mean, I feel that I don't feel that it's a narcissistic or inward-looking practice, because I really am negotiating sets of ideas that I think have a need to be investigated. For example, what it's like to be a woman in our contemporary society, in which mediation and media images and women being unable to have a free voice or a free space, you know, this continually is problematic. You know, like we have a recent suicide of a female celebrity. So these things are important, and it's important to think about about politics. I mean, so I'm thinking about big things, and then I make it, and I'm taking all of that really seriously. But just because I'm having fun doesn't mean to say it's a superficial endeavour. It's not a superficial endeavour. But I feel a productive citizen when I'm grappling with what I consider to be these kind of fundamental issues of our time. And I know that by editing the work, when I finish it off, when I really do kind of edit the work, I know that it's now got a lightness to it. I'm just offering the viewer space to investigate these things at whatever level they want. You know, I'm aiming to make work that rewards the viewer whatever time engagement they're going to give it, and I want to give someone who glances a good engagement and someone who spends hours, an engagement that keeps yielding for them, and that is in my mind as I make artwork about what kind of a engagement and how will that linger, because I think that good artwork, it exists, it functions well in the rumour, like as in if someone saw my performance and then they went and told their mate. I think a mate's it still functions beyond, absolutely. And then also somebody who's going to engage, spend time with my artwork and then see it again or kind of see subsequent works.
What about you, Sian?
Well, I was just going to say, actually, I think that it is important to acknowledge that, you know, like you're talking about making a little collage,
Yes.
and having fun, that those things, you do need the space to have those kind of more introverted and introspective moments of your practice, because from that comes the other stuff that becomes then important. So not everything that you do as an artist is going to be outwardly important, and a lot of what you do is not even necessarily going to be that good, but you have to do that in order to get to the good stuff. And that, I think that's a really fundamental lesson to learn. But I think that I guess I kind of reached a sort of crisis point just before I found out that I got on, well, just before the freelance program was, the open call went out, which was 2018, summer 2018. And I just finished doing Festival of the Mind, and I was working part-time, but I was working Monday to Friday, and I was really feeling that this was not sustainable, because I had no time ever. I spent all of my time either at my day job or in my studio or just being really exhausted. And, you know, I didn't see my friends, any of that, blah, blah, blah. And then I was very fortunate that I got onto freelance, which has allowed me to slow all of that down.
Yeah.
But I think the important lesson that I've learned from that is that whereas before I approached my work in quite a frantic sense, in that I felt like everything had to be, there had to be an output for everything. Everything had to end up in an exhibition or a performance or this or that. Everything had to be for something. And actually now I've been able to step back and just noodle around. And that, I think, has like improved the quality of my work.
It's given you a sort of sense of legitimacy, like that is okay because someone else's institution or an organisation has said, look, you know, we invest in you, we believe in you. Here is the time and the space to do this. This is important. Yeah,
I mean, I think I don't think you can underestimate the power of being validated by somebody else at all.
If only you could sell it in bottles. We'd all make a killing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to add to that, my equivalent is pretty harrowing, but around 2017, I had a migraine that lasted 9.5 months. And that,
oh my God,
I know, right? And then after that,
did you have like sight interference, extreme headaches?
It was no, I didn't have. It didn't start with lights, although all my other migraines do start with the aura. But no, it was just sustained, constant pain and light sensitivity. So I couldn't handle light.
That sounds like hell.
It was
hell.
Pretty bad, because there were periods where it was about just being in bed in pain with like listening to audiobooks and just having no light. Audiobooks on quite low. And so that was pretty tough. But what that means is that when Sian was talking about working quite frantically, I don't really work frantically anymore. Like I refuse to get, that was triggered by stress. And I now realise that I can't ever get stressed again. I have a real propensity to get headaches. I'm not over that now. That's still part of my life.
Does it give you the fear massively if you get a migraine?
I now, because I've been working so hard on not getting migraines, and I go to a physio really regularly, I don't get migraines, it's tension headaches.
Right.
And I do get tension headaches. It has been weekly, now it's more every couple of weeks, and I have to do a lot to prevent that, and I've got a lot in place to do that. But yeah, it gives me a sense of I'm not going to get stressed. So I've really developed you were asking about resilience earlier,
and strategies.
I've really developed a sense of personal resilience and robustness. It gives me a real clarity on bottom lines, as in, is this worth my effort? Yes or no? And so when I feel that I'm being called to work hard, then I really kind of just turn that around and say that, you know, I'm not. And it's given me really good boundaries, given me a really good sense of when I'm enjoying something or not. And that's why I really talk about pleasure, you know, foregrounding that in my practice. And that's not to say anything I do is superficial. It's that while I'm in the flow of my own art making, I'm really protected from stress. And I'm only really going to broaden that out and show it to an audience or work with other people or take it anywhere if that works for me and it's not going to stress me. And I can work to deadlines, but, you know, I'm not going to say yes to anything that will involve me being stressed.
That is a thing, isn't it? You know, I think a lot of freelancers in general, but specifically creatives, across the board, they have a real tendency and a fear of actually saying no, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, what if this
Yeah.
is the big opportunity, or what if I just do this bit of work for free, and if I just say yes to that.
Yeah.
And that's why, you know,
And I think
we
that's
all
a
burn
misnomer.
out so much.
I think, but that's being a participant in our kind of toxic neoliberalism, and stepping back from that makes me an anomaly, but it also is political. And
Yeah.
I also realise the more I say no and the more I refuse toxic practices, the more that I enable myself to behave like that in the future, and I enable other people to behave like that. It's like the more that we say yes to things that we think might be a good idea, but maybe in our gut we know is just lost labour and is stress, the more we take our own eye off the ball of what we want and what we want to say and what we want to achieve. But what I'm saying is I've really connected with what I want to make, with what I want to say and what I want to achieve, and I've got single pointed focus on that, and it means that I don't say yes to things that take me away from that.
I mean, I think it's also talking about how do you kind of deal with that stress and be resilient. Like, I do think you need the solidarity of the people that are around you, and you need to exercise solidarity towards them as well. And I think the art world can be very competitive, and often you're sort of pitted against each other. And I think one thing that I always want to remember is that actually, God, to use an awful Tory phrase, we're all in this together. That's horrific. I hate the fact that David Cameron has essentially stolen that sentence from all of us. But in the true sense, we are in this together, and we have to show solidarity towards each other, because that's how we're going to survive.
I can't think of a nicer sentiment to end on than that. We'll ignore the David Cameron reference, but creatives united together. Just very quickly to round things up, where can people find out more about you both independently, and, you know, have you got websites or social media channels? So if you just want to let us know where people can find out a bit more about you and your work, that would be great.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. My website, so my art name is Alison J. Carr. So Alison J. Carr, and my social media handles are Allie, Allie J. Carr.
My website is sianwilliams.org, Sian spelled SIAN. And my Instagram handle is sianwilliams__. And if you really want to get this far, I do have a Twitter, which is not really worth looking at it, but if you want to, it's @HelloMrWilliams.
Oh, excellent. Thank you both so much for coming to talk to us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
A Kurious Arts production.